220 American soldiers dead in 24 hours. That is Iran's official military claim, following coordinated strikes on the US Navy 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain and other bases. America's official response: 8 casualties? Maybe 10. One of those numbers is a lie, and satellite imagery tells you which one, but the definitive proof isn't on the ground. It's in the air. Right now, America's E-6B Mercury, the Doomsday Plane, is airborne over the region. That aircraft's sole purpose is to serve as a nuclear command post if Washington is destroyed. The official story is incompatible with that reality. The physical evidence that proves it is what you are about to see. We begin at the headquarters of the US 5th Fleet in Bahrain. Here is the primary command and control center on February 27th. Intact roofline, vehicles in rows, shadows on the tarmac. Now look at the satellite image from March 1st. Same coordinates, same frame. Where that building stood, there is now a crater ringed with scorched concrete. That image is not an outlier. The pattern repeats across the Gulf, at Al Udeid in Qatar and Al Dhafra in the UAE. Verified Planet Labs imagery shows the same dismantling of capacity. Radar arrays gone, hardened shelters split open, runways cratered, fuel depots blackened. Radar, aircraft and fuel, the entire launch chain, have been hit. This is the aftermath of a massive, coordinated, successful strike. The physical evidence is absolute, and it cannot coexist with any honest claim of minimal damage and no significant casualties from these same bases. But this destruction is not random. It matches the long-game strategy Iranian planners describe: avoid America's strength in a single decisive engagement and bleed it over time. Regional and Western analysts have given that approach a shorthand label: the 1,000 cuts strategy. The aim is not a dramatic victory. It is a grinding war of attrition to deplete stockpiles, stretch logistics, bleed personnel, and exhaust political will in Washington. Each crater is one more calculated cut in that campaign. The craters on the ground prove the attack. They prove the lie. They expose the Pentagon and the administration's casualty and limited damage storyline as an intentional information operation to bury the scale of a military disaster, not a fog of war miscount. Yet that is not the strongest evidence of how badly this war is going. The proof of defeat isn't in the debris in Bahrain or the UAE. It is 40,000 feet in the air, circling on an endless, desperate loop. That object circling at 40,000 feet has a name: the E-6B Mercury, the clearest signal of strategic failure you can put in the sky. This is not a bomber. It's not a fighter jet. In Pentagon language, it is a survivable airborne command post. The SACP, in plain English, a flying nerve center for Armageddon. Its single job is to relay emergency action messages, launch orders to the US nuclear triad if Washington DC and the ground-based command structure beneath it have already been erased. Inside the fuselage, consoles wash green light over strapped-in faces. The hum of avionics is broken only by clipped confirmations. Copy. Verified. They are not warriors, they are technicians. One reads from a laminated card while another keys in test codes, rehearsing how to take a launch order from a dead capital and push it to the nuclear triad. Their routine exists to keep that command moving after the people who signed it are ash. The quiet, procedural shape of a system planning for its own obliteration. A machine like this is not a signal to an enemy, so much as an admission. You only put your backup command system in the sky when you believe the primary, on the ground, may be destroyed, launching this E-6B in the middle of a war with Iran. and having its track flagged by OSINT analysts and then NBC News tells you whose options are failing. Washington does not spin up the airborne Doomsday network when it trusts its conventional plan. The plane's presence is the final admission that the United States is losing this conventional war badly enough to put its command structure at risk, a system quietly preparing for its own decapitation. That judgment no longer rests on flight data alone. Beijing, cautious until now, has just issued a warning that the conflict is sliding toward the nuclear threshold. That global power is China. And this is not a vague diplomatic line from their foreign ministry. It was a public assessment, an extraordinary breach of protocol from establishment policy analysts. Not TV panelists, but figures like Victor Gao of the China Institute of International Studies and Professor Jiang Xueqin. A strategic rival does not publicly spell out another superpower's failures unless the situation has crossed a critical line. Yet as the fighting escalated, their warning was carried in international outlets, Al Jazeera, Newsweek and others, and it came down to 3 unambiguous points in their own words. They put it in 3 lines. America has suffered more military damage than at any point since Vietnam. The trajectory is toward nuclear escalation. It must stop immediately. When your own flight data and satellite imagery say the conventional war is being lost, and a rival superpower goes on record that America has suffered more military damage, and the trajectory is toward nuclear escalation. This is no longer an analyst's model. It is a publicly acknowledged emergency. China is staring at the same evidence we just walked through and saying it out loud. So with the conventional war lost, and a rival superpower openly warning of a nuclear countdown, what was the leadership's next move? A rational de-escalation? A strategic withdrawal? No, they set in motion what can only be called a hostage creation program, a plan that makes stepping back more costly than driving forward into disaster. The plan, according to reports from outlets like NBC News and The Washington Post, was this: to send 5,000 American soldiers, potentially from the 82nd Airborne Division, onto Iranian soil. 5,000 soldiers. Into a country of roughly 90 million people. With a battle-hardened military that has spent decades shaping its terrain and doctrine for exactly this kind of invasion. Those 2 numbers do not describe a campaign. They describe a sacrifice. There is a cold technical term for what this action would produce. As one US military analyst later summarized it, 5,000 soldiers into that scenario doesn't achieve military objectives. It creates hostages. A force that's small, dropped into prepared enemy ground, and outnumbered in every direction, isn't maneuvering, it's waiting to be surrounded, cut off from resupply, and turned into bargaining chips. And what was the reaction inside Iran? Was it fear? Panic at the thought of American boots on the ground? No. The response was public mockery. In their public answer, Iranian leaders didn't threaten, they invited. The line was simple and they wanted it heard: bring your soldiers. They did not see a threat. They saw a pool of hostages delivered to them by a White House, too boxed in by its own promises to back down. Because once Tehran is openly inviting a token US force into a trap, every serious planner in Washington understands the military math. The only logic left for even considering such a move is domestic. A small symbolic deployment offers the illusion of escalation and resolve for audiences at home, instead of the one step no politician wants to take: standing in front of cameras and admitting that the war plan has failed. That is not strategy. It is proof that Washington's political objectives have broken completely away from battlefield reality, but desperation at that level raises a harder question. When leaders are willing to entertain a plan, that would turn 5,000 Americans into hostages and potentially escalate toward nuclear war, rather than concede defeat? What exactly are they trying to bury? What is the foundational error, the original sin, so catastrophic that they would gamble with escalation itself just to keep it in the dark? That question. What is the foundational error, the original sin? The answer is not an act on a battlefield. It was a document. A catastrophic intelligence failure, signed and delivered by the CIA and Mossad, which served as the war's birth certificate. This pre-war assessment made two core promises to the president, each stamped with the seal of authority. It was fantasy wrapped in rigor, slides, confidence levels, clean scenarios, presented as settled fact. First, they promised that assassinating Iran's supreme leader would be a clean decapitation strike that would trigger a popular uprising. They depicted a society ready to crumble, a people who would thank their liberators. Instead, they created a martyr. The streets of Tehran did not fill with grateful citizens waving American flags. They filled with funeral processions and black banners, crowds chanting his name and cursing the United States. That visible anger welded together people who had been arguing about everything else a week earlier. Second, the assessment promised that with the leader gone, the regime's command structure would shatter and the system would collapse from within. Instead, the opposite occurred. The Iranian military, built around regional commands, parallel chains of authority, and redundant control nodes precisely to survive such a strike, became more resilient. It did not break, it hardened. They had mastered the coordinates and misread the country. The tactical intelligence was flawless. They knew exactly where the target would be, down to the hour. But the strategic political intelligence, the understanding of the society itself, was a complete and catastrophic failure. Every single prediction was wrong. That one misread, that belief in a quick surgical decapitation, explains everything that followed. First, you massage the numbers. Fabricated casualty reports to suggest Iran is on its knees. Then, you invent victories. Stories of enemy ships sunk that never went down, crafted to reassure allies and markets that the plan is working. Finally, you reach for something reckless, a plan to drop 5,000 soldiers into a nation of 90 million and hope momentum does the rest. That isn't strategy. It's an attempt to bury the original mistake under ever larger moves. Admitting the truth would mean acknowledging to voters, to Congress, and to every allied capital that this war was launched on a fantasy. Careers would end, credibility would crater. So instead of cutting losses, they choose continuous escalation. Admitting they were this wrong is the one move they will not make. This wasn't a lone bad call by one analyst. It was the predictable outcome of a system that rewards optimistic stories and sidelines anyone who challenges them. What do you believe is the true cost when our institutions can no longer admit they were catastrophically wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments, but this isn't a new playbook. This exact sequence, flawed intelligence packaged as certainty, driving a disastrous war, followed by a desperate cover-up to hide the truth. That blueprint has been used before. And the last time Washington ran it, it destroyed the legacy of one of America's most trusted soldiers. We are watching it happen again, step for agonizing step. If this story of a war built on an intelligence lie sounds familiar, it's because it is. We've seen this playbook before. His name, Colin Powell, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs and now Secretary of State, the most trusted figure in America. On February 5th, 2003, after 4 days at CIA headquarters with Director George Tenet cramming, that credibility was put on the table at the United Nations Security Council. as he sat beneath the row of flags, a thick binder open in front of the microphone. For 75 minutes, he presented the case for war, armed with satellite photos and communications intercepts, the supposed proof of weapons of mass destruction. He was convincing because he himself was convinced. The world listened. And then the truth came out, not as a leak, but as a formal finding. The 2004 Dhafra report confirmed there were no WMDs. There never had been. The entire premise for the invasion was a catastrophic intelligence failure. The cost of that failure is a matter of public record. Over 4,400 American lives lost, and a price tag of more than $2 trillion stretching across years of combat operations, reconstruction, and long-term care for veterans. But there was another cost, a personal one. In later years, the commanding presence at the UN was gone. In its place, you see an older Powell, shoulders a little hunched, cadence slower, eyes dropping before the hardest words. His own words are the most damning. He called it a great intelligence failure. And then he said, "I am the one who presented it, and it will always be a part of my record. It was painful. It's a blot on my record." A $2 trillion blot on the ledger. And still not the end of the accounting, because every geopolitical playbook has a price tag. In this one, leaders front-load war decisions on contested intelligence, launder that doubt through a single trusted messenger, and let the real costs surface years later in balance sheets and in the lives of those who served. The price for running it again is not a historical footnote. It's being charged right now in the markets you own, as that same delayed cost structure is baked into government budgets, debt, and the assets tied to your retirement and your business. The only question is, do you understand the math? The math begins with a single geographic choke point, the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's daily oil consumption must pass. A prolonged disruption here is not theoretical. It's a direct shock to the world economy. After the initial strikes, Brent crude spiked toward $85 a barrel. Major banks and energy consultancies were already modeling scenarios in which a sustained closure of the Strait pushed prices toward $100, even $200 a barrel. But this recurring tragedy isn't just a matter of history. It has a hidden cost being priced into your future. The transmission mechanism is direct. Higher oil is an input into transportation, manufacturing, and food, not just an energy sector line item. According to Morgan Stanley's models, a sustained 10% rise in oil prices adds roughly 0.35 percentage points to US CPI within 3 months. That is not a headline guess. It's the arithmetic of how an oil shock becomes a broader price shock. This is how an intelligence failure in Tehran translates into higher prices at home. By raising the odds that traffic through Hormuz is disrupted, that miscalculation pushes up the risk premium in oil and feeds directly into a hotter inflation print in the data central banks watch. That, in turn, forces them into an impossible choice. They can raise interest rates to counter the inflation, but because the shock comes from energy supply rather than overheated demand, tighter policy does little to fix the underlying cost, and instead chokes credit, investment, and hiring. Or they can move cautiously and let inflation run hotter for longer, in which case households and businesses absorb higher prices, real incomes fall, spending slows, and growth stalls anyway. Either path converges on the same condition. Inflation that stays too high while output and employment stagnate. That is stagflation by definition, and it is the environment in which long-term investors are most exposed. Most institutions will not frame it that way until it is too late. They prefer talk of temporary disruptions and contained volatility, because acknowledging sustained stagflation risk would force them to question their own models. In simple terms though, the chain is clear. A miscalculation that raises Hormuz disruption risk leads to an oil price spike, pushes up CPI, forces central banks into this lose-lose policy corner, and produces a stagflationary backdrop where both sides of a 60-40 portfolio can reprice lower together. In a stagflationary environment, the foundational logic of the 60-40 stock and bond portfolio collapses. Goldman Sachs, drawing on past oil shock stagflation episodes, shows how supply-side shocks like this erode diversification. Stocks fall as growth expectations weaken. Bonds fall as persistent inflation keeps yields high instead of allowing rate cuts, and 60-40 portfolios deliver weak or even negative real returns after inflation. Both sides of the portfolio bleed at the same time, not because of market panic, but because the underlying regime has changed. That is the math of the first order effect, a direct energy shock running through inflation, monetary policy, and the conventional model of wealth preservation. It is a mechanical assault on the assumptions behind most so-called balanced portfolios. But even this is only the most visible crack in the system. The deeper vulnerability, the one that multiplies this risk across the real economy, sits one layer down in the architecture of global supply chains. And that is the second order calculation we need to map next. That calculation is the hidden math of the supply chain multiplier, and it begins not in an oil field, but on a container ship in the Red Sea. We are now beyond first-order effects. Washington's core misjudgment, the catastrophic intelligence failure you've seen throughout this story, is colliding with the physics of global trade. Iranian planners understand exactly where that leverage sits. By using proxies to strike at critical shipping lanes, they don't just harass traffic, they force global logistics networks to fracture. This is not a nuisance. It is a deliberate weapon of economic attrition. Follow what happens to a single shipping lane once it comes under fire. After successful drone or missile strikes, risk premia jump, and major carriers begin rerouting a significant share of traffic around the Cape of Good Hope instead of cutting through the Red Sea. On key Asia-Europe routes that take this detour, spot container rates on some sailings have already roughly tripled compared with pre-disruption levels. But the damage does not stop at the freight invoice. Rerouting means more fuel burned, higher crew and charter costs, sharply higher war risk and insurance premiums, and most critically, voyages that now take several extra weeks. Those weeks translate into real shortages. India-sourced pharmaceuticals arriving late into European markets, and electronics assemblers idling while they wait for Asian semiconductors. Associated Press reporting has already highlighted drug and goods delays tied to these diversions. Syracuse University supply chain analyses have mapped how those longer routes and lead times cascade through inventories and production schedules. This is not a theoretical forecast. It is the operating environment right now. That is how a missile fired in the Red Sea directly compresses the profit margin of a company in the S&P 500 with zero direct energy exposure. So let's make the hidden math explicit. Imagine a Michigan auto parts manufacturer that sells $1 billion a year into the US and European markets with a 10% operating margin. That's $100 million in profit. Now assume it sources critical electronic modules and wiring harnesses from Asia, and the logistics and handling to move those components across this corridor account for about 5% of its revenue. Oh, when that cost to serve line item jumps by roughly 40%, in line with what recent Institute for Supply Management surveys are reporting for companies hit by supply chain disruptions, that 5% becomes 7%. Nothing about the sales price changes, but operating margin drops from 10% to 8%. That is 200 basis points of margin compression, or 20 million wiped out over a year, purely from higher freight, insurance and delay. And that is before you factor in lost revenue, when delayed semiconductors forced production lines to idle. The same ISM surveys show that roughly 2/3 of affected firms report revenue losses following these disruptions, because they simply cannot deliver product on time. For any thin margin manufacturer, even a low single-digit revenue shortfall on top of a 200 basis point cost squeeze is the difference between meeting guidance and issuing a profit warning. This is no longer about oil tankers. It is about every component in every finished product that crosses an ocean. It functions as a hidden tax on the entire economy, imposed by Washington's refusal to admit that its conventional strategy against Iran has failed, giving Tehran and its proxies the freedom to weaponize global shipping lanes. Use this framework. Trace the second and third order supply chain effects instead of stopping at headline CPI or Brent crude. Look directly at which companies in your portfolio depend on imported intermediate goods moving through choke points like the Red Sea, and how much margin cushion they really have. The official story will always lag reality. Its function is to manage perception, not to map risk. What we are doing here is giving you the tools to read the evidence yourself, to see this hidden math before it shows up in earnings, and to protect the wealth and legacy you have built. If you want to stay ahead of that gap between narrative and reality, if you want to keep seeing the hidden math that links missiles, shipping lanes, and your portfolio, hit like, subscribe, and stay with this channel. We will keep connecting these geopolitical miscalculations to concrete balance sheet outcomes so you can position before the broader market is forced to react.